Welcome back to our cozy corner of history. Tonight, I want you to imagine something with me. It is January, the year is 1230, and you are lying on your back in a long, narrow room made entirely of stone. The ceiling arches above you like the rib cage of some great slumbering beast, and the air is so cold that each breath leaves your lips as a pale ribbon of mist. Beneath you, there is no mattress, not as you would understand one. There is a wooden frame, and upon it a thin sack of straw. It crackles faintly every time you shift your weight. A single woolen blanket covers your body, and beneath that blanket you are fully dressed. Your coarse wool habit, your belt cinched tight around your waist, your leather shoes. You sleep in everything you own, because in a few short hours you will need to rise, immediately, without hesitation, and descend into the freezing darkness of the church below. You are a monk. This is Revol's Abbey, in the remote valleys of North Yorkshire, and this is how you will sleep for the rest of your life.
Around you, in neat rows stretching the length of the dormitory, 30 other men lie in identical beds. No one speaks. No one has spoken since the final prayer of the evening, and no one will speak again until morning. This is the Great Silence, a sacred hush that blankets the monastery like snowfall. The only sound is breathing. 30 men inhaling and exhaling in the cold, their rhythms slowly falling into unison as if the room itself is drawing breath. At the far end of the dormitory, a single candle burns. The rule requires it. There must always be light, a small flickering defiance against the darkness. It casts long shadows across the stone walls, and if you watch those shadows long enough, they seem to move like something alive. You close your eyes. Sleep comes eventually, not easily, not warmly, but it comes, because your body has learned that this is all the comfort it will ever receive. And for now, for these few fragile hours, there is peace. But the bell is coming.
Somewhere below you, in the belly of the abbey, the sacristan is watching the stars through a narrow window. He is calculating the hour. And when he decides the time has come, somewhere around 2 in the morning, he will pull the rope, and the bell will shatter the silence, and you will arise, and you will pray. This was not punishment. This was not a prison. This was a life freely chosen by thousands of men across medieval Europe for century after century after century. And so tonight, as you lie in your own bed, in your own warm room, let us ask the question together. How did they do it? How did medieval monks sleep in freezing stone monasteries, on straw beds, in broken shifts for decades on end? What did it do to their bodies? What did it do to their minds? And what perhaps did they understand about sleep that we have long since forgotten? Let us find out. Settle in. The night is long, and the story is longer. To understand how a medieval monk slept, you must first understand the book that governed every hour of his existence. Not the Bible, though that was ever present. No, the book that dictated when he woke, when he ate, when he spoke, and when he closed his eyes was far shorter, far more specific,
and in many ways far more powerful in shaping daily life. It was called the Rule of Saint Benedict, and for over 1,000 years it was the operating manual for Western monasticism. Benedict of Nursia was born around the year 480 in a small town in central Italy. He came from a respectable family, comfortable enough to send him to Rome for his education. But Rome, in the late 5th century, was a city in decline. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed just a few years earlier. The streets that once hummed with imperial ambition now echoed with disorder. And the young Benedict, appalled by what he saw, the corruption, the moral rot, the hollow pursuit of pleasure, did something radical. He walked away. He left Rome. He left his studies. He left his family's plans for him, and he disappeared into the wilderness east of the city, eventually settling in a cave near the ruins of Nero's old palace at Subiaco. There, alone in the rock and the silence, he lived as a hermit for 3 years. Word spread, as it always does. Other men came to him, drawn by his reputation for holiness. Small communities formed. Benedict organized them, guided them, and in time he established a monastery at Monte Cassino, a hilltop south of Rome that would become the most famous monastery in the Western world. And it was there, sometime around the year 530, that he sat down and wrote his rule. The Rule of Saint Benedict is not a long document. It contains 73 short chapters, and you could read the entire thing in an afternoon. But do not mistake its brevity for simplicity. Within those chapters lies one of the most carefully designed systems for communal living ever created. It covers everything: how to elect an abbot, how to admit new members, how to discipline those who misbehave, how to distribute clothing, how to serve meals.
And, critically for our story tonight, how to sleep. Chapter 22 of the Rule is titled simply, On How the Monks Are to Sleep. It is barely a page long, and yet these few sentences shaped the sleeping lives of hundreds of thousands of men and women across Europe for over a millennium. Let me walk you through it. First, Benedict writes, "Each monk shall have his own bed." This may seem obvious to us, but in the early medieval world, sharing a bed was commonplace, even among strangers at inns. Benedict insisted on individual beds arranged in a common dormitory. Privacy, in the modern sense, did not exist. You slept in a room with your brothers, the abbot's bed among them, so that he could watch over his flock, even in the hours of darkness. Next, the bedding. Benedict prescribed a mat, a woolen blanket, a thinner covering, perhaps linen, and a pillow. That was all. No furs, no feather beds, no luxuries of any kind. The point was sufficiency, not comfort. You were given what you needed to survive the night, and not one thread more. Then comes the detail that surprises most modern readers. Benedict required his monks to sleep fully clothed. They were to lie down in their habits, the heavy woolen robes that defined their order, with their belts fastened around their waists. The reason was practical and spiritual in equal measure. Practically, a monk needed to be ready to rise at a moment's notice when the bell rang for the night office. There was no time for dressing. The bell rang, and you stood. Spiritually, sleeping in your habit was a symbol of perpetual readiness, a reminder that a monk was never truly off duty. Even in sleep,
he belonged to God. Benedict also insisted that monks should not have knives at their sides while they slept. This is a small detail, almost easy to overlook, but it tells us something important. Monks carried small knives during the day, utilitarian tools for eating, for cutting cord, for the daily tasks of monastic labor. But at night, in the darkness, in a room full of sleeping men, Benedict wanted no blades. Whether this was a precaution against accidents, against nightmares turning violent, or against darker temptations, the rule does not say. It simply forbids it.
And finally, the candle. A light must burn in the dormitory throughout the night. All night. Every night. This was not merely for convenience, though stumbling over sleeping monks in pitch darkness was certainly a concern. The candle was a symbol. Light against darkness. Wakefulness against the spiritual dangers of the night. In the medieval mind, the dark hours were when the soul was most vulnerable to temptation, to despair, to the whispers of the devil. A candle burning through the night was a small but steady act of resistance. Now, I want you to pause for a moment and consider what is missing from this list. There is no mention of heating, no fireplace in the dormitory, no hot stones wrapped in cloth, no braziers of glowing coals. The dormitory was, by design, unheated. In the mild winters of central Italy, where Benedict wrote his rule, this was manageable. But when his rule was carried northward, to the rain-soaked hills of England, to the frozen plains of northern France and Germany, the absence of heat became something altogether more severe. Monks in Yorkshire and Normandy followed the same rule written for the Italian countryside, and they followed it to the letter. The dormitory remained unheated. The blanket remained thin. The straw mattress remained the only barrier between a man's body and the cold.
And this brings us to something essential about the Rule of Saint Benedict, something that made it so enduring and so influential. Benedict did not write a rule for comfort. He wrote a rule for the soul. The body was a servant of the spirit, and its complaints, the aching joints, the shivering limbs, the desperate longing for warmth, were not problems to be solved. They were opportunities. Opportunities for patience, for humility, for offering one's suffering to God as a quiet, private prayer. Yet Benedict was no extremist, and this is what set his rule apart from the harsher monastic traditions that came before him. In the deserts of Egypt, early Christian monks had practiced astonishing feats of self-denial, standing on pillars for years, fasting until their bones showed through their skin, refusing sleep entirely as a spiritual challenge. Benedict looked at these traditions and chose a different path. He called his rule a little rule for beginners. He emphasized moderation. Yes, the monk would be cold. Yes, the monk would be tired. Yes, the monk would rise in the dead of night to chant psalms in a freezing church. But he would also be fed. He would be clothed. He would be given a bed, a blanket, and a candle. He would not be destroyed by his devotion. This balance between discipline and mercy, between austerity and survival, is what allowed Benedictine monasticism to spread across the whole of Europe. From Monte Cassino, the rule traveled to France, to Germany, to England, to Scandinavia. By the High Middle Ages, there were thousands of monasteries following Benedict's instructions, and in every single one, monks were lying down on straw beds, fully clothed, beneath a single woolen blanket, waiting for the bell. The rule was written in the 6th century. Monasteries were still following it, virtually unchanged, in the 16th. 1,000 years of men sleeping the same way, in the same cold, under the same flickering candlelight. Think about that for a moment. 1,000 years.
We change our mattresses every decade. We adjust our thermostats by the hour. We have apps that track our sleep cycles, and smart pillows that cool our heads, and weighted blankets designed to simulate the feeling of being held. And still, we lie awake at night, restless, anxious, staring at the ceiling. The monks had none of it. A sack of straw, a woolen blanket, a stone room with no heat, and a bell that would wake them at 2 in the morning without fail. And yet they slept, night after night, year after year, century after century. Perhaps they knew something we have forgotten, and perhaps, as the night goes on, we will begin to remember what it was. But first, we must visit the monastery itself. We must walk through its cloisters, climb its stairs, and feel the cold of its stones beneath our feet. Let us go to Rivaux. And so, with these words etched into the consciousness of Western civilization, a new kind of life took shape. Not in the palaces of emperors, nor the forums of philosophers, but in the quiet stone corridors of the monastery. Let us step inside one. Imagine yourself standing at the gates of a Benedictine abbey somewhere in the English countryside. The year is perhaps 1120. The Norman conquest is still within living memory for the oldest brothers, and the great age of monastic building is well underway. The first thing you would notice is the silence, not the empty silence of abandonment, but a living silence, a silence that hums with intention. Every stone here was laid with purpose. Every corridor, every archway, every garden path was designed not for beauty alone, but for the shaping of a human life. The monastery was, in many ways, the most carefully designed living environment in the medieval world. While peasants huddled in smoky one-room dwellings, and even nobles endured draughty halls with little privacy, the monastery was a masterwork of functional architecture. Every room had its role. Every space served the rule. At the heart of it all stood the church, not merely a place of worship, but the axis around which the entire community turned. The church was the first building constructed, and everything else radiated outward from it. The dormitory, the refectory, the chapter house, the infirmary, the guest quarters, the kitchens, the workshops, all connected, all deliberate. And for our purposes tonight, for the story of sleep, the most important building in the entire complex was the dormitory. The dorter, as it was known in medieval English, sat directly adjacent to the church. This was no accident. A covered staircase, called the night stairs, connected the dormitory to the transept of the church. In the small hours of the morning, when the bell rang for matins, the monks would descend these stairs in darkness, their bare feet on cold stone, filing silently into the church to begin their prayers. Think about that for a moment. The building where you slept was physically joined to the building where you prayed. There was no separation between rest and devotion. Sleep was not an escape from the spiritual life. It was embedded within it. You closed your eyes in one room and opened them in another, and the distance between the two was no more than a few dozen steps down a narrow staircase. This
was architecture as theology.
Now, the dormitory itself would seem austere by any modern standard. In the earliest Benedictine communities, the monks slept in a single large room, a great open hall with a row of simple beds along each wall. Benedict's rule specified that each monk should have his own bed, furnished with a mattress, a woolen blanket, a linen underblanket, and a pillow. That was all. There were no private chambers, no curtains, no doors to close. The abbot or his deputy slept among the brothers, often positioned near the center of the room where he could observe. A candle burned through the night. Benedict insisted upon this, so that darkness never fully claimed the space. The monks slept in their day clothes, belted and ready, so that when the bell called, they could rise without delay. It was, in every sense, communal sleeping, and this was the point. Privacy, in the Benedictine understanding, was a luxury that bred temptation. The cell, the private room, would come later in monastic history, adopted by the Carthusians and eventually by other orders. But for Benedict's monks, the shared dormitory was both a practical arrangement and a spiritual discipline.
You learned to sleep beside your brothers. You learned to ignore their coughing, their restlessness, their murmured prayers. You learned that even in sleep you were not alone, that the community held you, watched over you, carried you through the vulnerable hours of night. But here is what I find truly remarkable about this arrangement, and what sets it apart from almost every other sleeping culture in history. The monks did not sleep through the night. They were never meant to. The bell for matins, the great night office, rang sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning, depending on the season and the customs of the particular house. At that signal, every monk in the dormitory rose from his bed, descended the night stairs, and entered the church for what could be an hour or more of psalms, readings, and prayers. After matins, they returned to the dormitory. They slept again, this second sleep lasting until the bell for lauds rang at dawn. 2 sleeps, divided by prayer. Night after night, year after year, for the entirety of a monk's life. We discussed in our earlier chapter how the historian Roger E. Kirch uncovered evidence of segmented sleep throughout pre-industrial Europe, how ordinary people routinely experienced a first sleep and a second sleep, with a period of wakefulness in between. The monastery did not invent this pattern, but it did something far more radical. It institutionalized it. It gave it meaning. It wrapped it in liturgy and purpose and made it sacred. For the ordinary medieval peasant, the wakeful period between first and second sleep was a time for quiet reflection, for tending the fire, perhaps for conversation or intimacy. It was natural and unstructured, but for the Benedictine monk, that same biological window, that gentle emergence from deep sleep into a state of quiet alertness, was claimed for God.
And there is something profound in that. The most liminal hours of the human experience, the hours when the mind drifts between consciousness and dream, when the boundaries of self grow soft and permeable, those hours were devoted to prayer. Not the bright, energetic prayer of morning, not the grateful prayer of evening, but the deep interior prayer of the middle night, when the world outside the monastery walls lay utterly still. The monks believed that this prayer was different from all other prayer, that the night office carried a special power precisely because it cost something, because it required the sacrifice of comfort, of warmth,
of the body's deepest desire to remain asleep. The medieval mystics wrote of the night hours as a time when the soul was most open, most receptive, most capable of encountering the divine. And so the monastery bell became perhaps the most important sound in Western civilization's relationship with sleep. It divided the night. It structured the darkness. It told every monk, every night, that sleep was not his own, that even the unconscious hours belonged to something greater than himself.
Let us stay here a moment longer, in this dormitory, in this half-light between sleeps, because there are details worth noticing, small things that reveal how deeply the rule shaped every aspect of rest. The monks slept on their backs or their sides, never on their stomachs. This was a matter of modesty and self-discipline. The position of the body in sleep was considered a reflection of the soul's disposition. Even unconscious, you were expected to maintain a kind of dignity. The woolen blanket was sufficient for warmth, but not for luxury. In the bitterest winters of northern Europe, monks sometimes slept in their cloaks as well, but additional bedding was not easily granted. Comfort, remember, was not the goal. Sufficiency was. And the beds themselves were simple wooden frames with straw or wool mattresses. They were not soft. They were not designed for the kind of deep, unbroken sleep that we chase today. They were designed for a sleep that served a rhythm, a sleep that could be entered and exited quickly, cleanly, without the grogginess that comes from sinking too deeply into comfort.
The entire dormitory, in other words, was engineered for segmented sleep. Every material choice, every spatial arrangement, every rule about clothing and candlelight and proximity, all of it pointed toward a single idea, that sleep was not a block of darkness to be endured, but a structured experience to be navigated with intention. This is so far from how we think about sleep today that it can feel almost alien. We build our bedrooms for maximum comfort. We invest in memory foam and blackout curtains and white noise machines. We treat sleep as a problem to be optimized, a resource to be maximized. And when we fail to sleep perfectly, when we wake at 2 a.m. and stare at the ceiling, we call it insomnia. We call it a disorder. The Benedictine monks would have called it matins. There is something worth sitting with in that thought as you settle deeper into wherever you are resting tonight. The idea that waking in the night is not a failure, that the quiet hours are not empty hours, that perhaps, just perhaps, we have lost something in our relentless pursuit of the perfect 8-hour sleep.
But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The dormitory is only one room in this great stone complex, and the story of monastic sleep extends far beyond its walls. In our next chapter, we will follow the monks through their entire day, from the first bell before dawn to the final prayers of Compline, and discover how the Benedictine schedule created the most structured daily routine the Western world had ever seen. A routine that would echo through the centuries and shape the way we still think about time, productivity, and rest. For now, though, let the dormitory hold you. Let the candlelight flicker. Let the silence settle. And rest. We have spent time in the dormitory, in the still, candlelit quiet of the monks at rest. But before any Benedictine monk could lay his head upon that simple pillow, before he could close his eyes and surrender to the first sleep, there was one final obligation, one final threshold to cross. there was Compline. Compline is a word that comes from the Latin completorium, meaning completion. It was the final office of the canonical day, the last of the 8 prayer hours that structured every waking moment of Benedictine life. After Compline, the day was done, not just finished in the way that a task is finished or a meal concluded, but sealed, closed, handed back to God, and surrendered completely.
If the monastery was a clock, Compline was its final chime. Let us return to our imagined abbey in the English countryside in that same year of 1120. The sun has long since dropped below the hills. The kitchen fires have been banked for the night. The last of the evening's work, the copying of manuscripts, the mending of habits, the tending of the herb garden has been set aside. The community gathers now in the church for the last time before morning. They walk in silence. This silence is not the ordinary silence of the cloister, the quiet that is simply the absence of unnecessary speech. This silence has a different quality. It is anticipatory. It is the silence of men preparing to hand the day over, to make an accounting before sleep, to stand at the edge of consciousness and look back at the hours that have passed. The office of Compline is the shortest of the 8 hours. It lasts perhaps 20 minutes in most Benedictine houses, sometimes a little longer, depending on the season and the customs of the community. But what it lacks in length, it more than compensates for in weight, in atmosphere, in intention.
It begins, as all the hours do, with the calling of the community to attention. The presiding monk, usually the prior or a senior brother appointed for the week, strikes the signal, and the choir takes their places in the carved wooden stalls that line each side of the church. In the cold months, their breath is visible in the candlelight, small clouds of vapor rising and dissolving in the dark air above their heads. The office opens with a brief reading, a short passage of Scripture, often from the first letter of Peter, with its famous admonition, "Be sober and watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." It is a striking way to begin a prayer service designed to send men to sleep. But this is entirely intentional. The reading is a reminder, a sharp, clear note of spiritual alertness, before the community descends into the slower, more contemplative prayer that follows.
Because Compline is, above all else, a prayer of surrender, and you cannot truly surrender what you have not first acknowledged. You cannot hand the night to God without first recognizing that the night holds real darkness, real vulnerability, real danger, whether physical or spiritual. After the opening reading comes the centerpiece of Compline, the Psalms. In most Benedictine traditions, the same 3 or 4 psalms were sung at Compline every single night without variation. Night after night, year after year, decade after decade, the same words, the same melodies, the same voices rising in the same stone church. The psalms chosen for Compline were not selected at random. They were chosen with extraordinary care over centuries of monastic practice because they spoke directly to the experience of night, to the fears and the quietness, and the particular quality of darkness that falls when a community prepares for sleep.
Chief among them was Psalm 91, the Great Protection Psalm, known in the Latin tradition as the Qui Habitat. It begins, "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High, who abides in the shadow of the Almighty, I will say to the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in whom I trust." And it continues with that extraordinary catalog of reassurances that reads even today like a lullaby for the spiritually anxious. "You will not fear the terror of the night, nor the arrow that flies by day, nor the pestilence that stalks in darkness, nor the destruction that wastes at noonday. You will not fear the terror of the night." Imagine hearing those words every evening for 30, 40, 50 years. Imagine the way they would sink into the body, not just into the conscious mind, but into the deeper layers of the self, the place where anxiety lives, where the unresolved fears of the day collect and pool and wait for the darkness to give them shape.
This was the genius of Compline. It did not simply tell the monks to be unafraid. It did not offer a theological argument for why the night was safe. It did something far more powerful. It repeated, night after night, a set of words that the body would eventually learn to associate with safety, with the transition from wakefulness to sleep, with the letting go of the day. We would call this, in the language of modern psychology, a conditioned relaxation response. The medieval monks had no such vocabulary, of course. They would simply have called it prayer. But the mechanism is identical, and it works. After the Psalms came the hymn. In the Benedictine tradition, the Compline hymn was often the Te Lucis ante terminum, a brief, luminous prayer addressed to the God of light at the ending of light. Before the ending of the day, Creator of the world, we pray that with thy wonted care thou guard and keep us from all snare.
The melody of this hymn is one of the oldest surviving pieces of Western music. It predates the Norman conquest, predates the great cathedrals, predates almost everything we might call the architecture of the medieval world. In some Benedictine communities, it survives to this day, sung in the same mode, in the same rhythm, as it was sung 12 centuries ago in the monasteries of Italy and France and Ireland. There is a particular kind of peace that comes from connecting with something that ancient, from letting your voice join a thread of sound that stretches back across 1,000 years of human experience. The monks may not have thought of it in quite those terms, but they felt it, that continuity, that rootedness, that sense of belonging to something vast and enduring. Following the hymn came the short reading, the capitulum, and then the responsory. And then, at the very still center of Compline, the Canticle of Simeon, the Nunc Dimittis, from the 2nd chapter of Luke's Gospel. Lord, now you let your servant go in peace, according to your word. For my eyes have seen your salvation. These were the words spoken by the old man Simeon in the temple when he held the infant Jesus in his arms. The words of someone who had waited long for something and had finally, at the end of a long life, seen it fulfilled.
the words of completion, of release, of a life surrendered not in defeat, but in deep satisfaction. The monks sang these words every night. They sang them as a prayer for sleep, a rehearsal, some of the early commentators suggested, for death itself. Because in the Benedictine tradition, sleep and death were understood as cousins. Each night the monk closed his eyes and released his hold on consciousness, trusting that he would wake again. Each night was a small act of faith in the morning. Sleep, in this understanding, was not a biological necessity grudgingly accommodated by the spiritual life. It was itself a spiritual practice, a nightly act of surrender and trust, bookended by prayer, embedded in community, held within a structure that gave it meaning. After the Nunc Dimittis came the blessing. The presiding monk blessed the community, and then something happened that set Compline apart from every other office in the Benedictine day.
The Great Silence began. The Great Silence was the period of absolute quiet that extended from the end of Compline until after the recitation of Prime the following morning. It was not merely the absence of conversation, it was the suspension of the entire social life of the community. No teaching, no direction, no chapter business, no discussion of any kind. Even the abbot, whose authority was absolute in every other waking moment, did not speak during the Great Silence unless the monastery were burning. This silence was protective. It was a kind of moat around the act of sleep, a buffer between the noise and activity of the day and the vulnerable quiet of the night. You crossed into the Great Silence, and the world shrank down to its simplest elements. The walk to the dormitory, the unlacing of sandals, the folding of the outer habit, the cool of the woolen blanket, the distant flicker of the night candle.
And in this silence, before sleep finally claimed him, the monk was expected to perform one last interior act, the examination of conscience. A brief, quiet reckoning, not an elaborate theological analysis, but a simple turning of the attention inward. Where have I failed today? Where have I been less than I was called to be? What needs to be released before I can rest? This examination was not meant to provoke anxiety. Quite the opposite. It was a technique for clearing the mind before sleep, for naming the unfinished business of the day so that it could be set aside, rather than left to circle and resurface in the restless hours of the night. Modern cognitive behavioral therapists recommend something remarkably similar: a deliberate end-of-day review, a conscious acknowledgement of incomplete tasks as a way of reducing the intrusive thoughts that keep us awake. The monks did not have cognitive behavioral therapy. They had Compline. And so the day ended, not with exhaustion collapsing into unconsciousness, not with the blue light of a screen finally extinguished, not with the mind still racing through tomorrow's concerns. It ended with ceremony, with community, with words older than the building that housed them, and a silence deeper than anything the waking world could offer.
The monks slept, and the night, having been so carefully prepared for, received them. Compline is over. The Great Silence has descended across the monastery like a second darkness, softer than the darkness of the sky outside, but in its own way just as complete. The monks have left the church. They have filed back through the cloister in their unbroken, wordless procession, and now they climb the night stairs, those worn, familiar stone steps that connect the church to the dormitory,
and one by one they pass through the doorway at the top and enter the room where the night will hold them until the matin spell calls them back. This moment, the crossing of that threshold, was not considered unremarkable in the Benedictine tradition. It was a significant transition, a meaningful passage from one state of being to another, and the monks understood it as such.
Let us stay with this transition for a while tonight, because the movement from wakefulness into sleep was, in the medieval monastic world, attended by its own particular customs, prayers, and understandings. And in exploring them, we discover something that reaches far beyond the monastery walls. We discover what it once meant for a human being to deliberately, intentionally, and reverently prepare to lose consciousness. To go to sleep, in other words, was not simply to stop being awake. The first thing a monk did upon reaching his bed was removed his sandals. Benedict's rule was specific about this. Sandals were placed neatly beside the bed, not left scattered on the floor. This was not merely tidiness, though the rule valued tidiness as an expression of inner order. It was a ritual unshodding, a deliberate putting aside of the footwear that connected a man to the active, purposeful world of the day. You removed your sandals, and you became, in a small but real way, a different kind of creature. Less walker, less worker, less participant in the horizontal world of corridors and gardens and chapter houses, and more of a still and vertical soul prepared to travel inward.
The outer habit, the wide-sleeved woolen robe that identified each monk as a member of his community, was loosened but not removed. Benedict specified that monks should sleep dressed, belted, and ready, so that the call to matins could be answered quickly and without confusion. There was no elaborate undressing, no change into different clothes. You lay down in the same garment in which you had prayed, worked, eaten, and walked. The continuity was deliberate. You were, even in sleep, still yourself, still a monk, still a member of this community, still accountable to the rule that shaped your every waking moment. And then he lay down. He pulled the woolen blanket across his body, that same rough, sufficient, unluxurious blanket that Benedict had prescribed. He settled onto his back or his side, never his stomach, because the position of the body in sleep was considered a reflection of interior disposition, and prostration, lying face down, was a posture reserved for acts of extreme penitence, not for ordinary nightly rest. And in those first quiet moments, before sleep came, there were prayers.
Not the formal, communal prayers of the canonical hours. Those had finished with Compline. These were interior prayers, private, personal, the small, quiet conversation between a soul and its God in the last moments before consciousness dimmed. The medieval church had a tradition of specific night prayers, brief formulas that a monk or a layperson could recite upon lying down, placing themselves under divine protection before surrendering to the vulnerability of sleep. The most common of these drew on the same psalms that had been sung at Compline, the verses of Psalm 91 about not fearing the terror of the night, the words of the Nunc Dimittis about releasing the self into peace. But there were also simpler prayers, barely more than a sentence long, that generations of monks had carried from their novitiate through decades of monastic life, prayers that asked for a night free from deception,
prayers that committed the soul into God's keeping in the hours when the will was suspended and the body entirely open, prayers that acknowledged with a kind of quiet courage that sleep was a small rehearsal for the final surrender that every human being must eventually make.
This understanding that sleep was a rehearsal for death was not a morbid concept in the medieval monastic tradition. It was a consoling one. The Latin phrase dormitio, sleep, was the same word used for the death of saints. The Church spoke of those who had died in faith as having fallen asleep in the Lord. The dormitory itself took its name from the same root, dormitorium, the place of sleeping, but was understood to share something of its character with the resting place of the faithful dead. To lie down each night and close your eyes, in this tradition, was to practice the most important act of your spiritual life, to practice trusting, to practice releasing, to practice the giving over of everything you could not control, your breath, your heartbeat, your consciousness itself, into the hands of something greater and more permanent than yourself. But let us step back from theology for a moment and simply be present in the dormitory, because there is a sensory experience here that deserves attention, a texture of experience that no amount of theological analysis quite captures.
The dormitory at night was cold. In the months between October and April, the cold in a stone building in northern England was not merely uncomfortable. It was a physical presence. It occupied the air. It settled against the skin. It crept through wool and linen with a patience that was almost personal. The monks had their blankets and their habits, and the warmth generated by a room full of sleeping bodies. But they did not have warmth in abundance. They had warmth insufficiency, which is a different thing entirely. And the dormitory was not silent. The great silence meant that no one spoke. But the human body, even in sleep, is not a quiet thing. There was breathing, the slow, heavy breathing of men in deep sleep, unguarded and completely natural. There was the occasional shift of weight on a straw mattress, the soft compression of wool, the creak of a wooden bed frame settling. There was sometimes coughing, the particular nighttime cough of men who lived in damp stone buildings and worked outdoors in all weathers. There was occasionally the murmured fragment of a dream, a word or half-word spoken into the dark without any waking intention.
All of this was simply the sound of the community at rest, and a monk who had lived in this dormitory for years would have found it not disturbing, but deeply familiar, comforting even. The breathing of his brothers was the sound of safety. It meant that the community endured, that the night had not taken anyone, that the world would continue in the morning, in the same form it had held the evening before. There is a medieval medical text written by a scholar working in the tradition of Galen and Avicenna, whose ideas about the human body shaped medical thinking from ancient Greece through the early modern period, that describes the onset of sleep in terms that are strangely beautiful. According to the humoral theory that underpinned medieval medicine, sleep was caused by the vapors rising from the stomach after eating, ascending through the body and reaching the brain, where they cooled and condensed and produced a kind of gentle heaviness in the head. The brain, thus cooled, ceased its ordinary activity. The animal spirits, the vital forces that animated the body, retreated inward, withdrawing from the extremities,
the way a fire draws its heat towards its center when the fuel grows low.
This is not, of course, how sleep actually works. The neuroscience of sleep had not yet been imagined. But what strikes me about this medieval description is not its scientific inaccuracy, it is its poetry. The idea of the vital spirits withdrawing from the surface of the body and retreating inward. The idea of the brain cooling and stilling. The image of a fire banking itself for the night, conserving its heat against the long, cold hours ahead.
There is something right about that image, even though the biology is wrong. Because sleep does feel like a withdrawal. It feels like the self drawing back from its edges. The skin grows less important. The sounds of the room grow less distinct. The thoughts, which have been running all day like water over stones, restless and various and purposeful, begin to slow, to lose their edges, to drift apart from each other in the way that objects drift apart when a current slows. This is the threshold. The monks lay on their narrow beds in the cold dormitory and crossed it, one by one, in their own time and in their own way. There was no signal for when to stop praying and simply sleep. There was no instruction for when the interior conversation should give way to interior silence. It happened as it happens for all of us, not as an act of will, but as the giving out of will. You cannot decide to fall asleep. You can only create the conditions, and then wait, and then, eventually, without quite noticing the moment it occurs, you are gone.
And they were gone, into the first sleep, into that deep, dark, restorative quiet that the body insists upon and the soul, in the Benedictine understanding, surrenders to willingly, not as a defeat, but as a form of trust, a declaration made in the most physical way possible that the monk did not hold himself together by force of will alone, that he could release his grip on consciousness and still, when morning came, find himself intact, that the world would hold him through the night, that the God to whom Compline had been addressed was not merely a liturgical convention, but a living presence in the cold dark of the dormitory, as present in the silence after the last prayer as in the singing itself. And so the monastery slept. The first sleep deepened, and the hours moved in their ancient circuit above the hills, and somewhere in the body of each sleeping monk the great work of physical and spiritual restoration quietly proceeded, until the next chapter of the night called them back. Rest now. Let the first sleep find you.
You have been asleep. For how long, it is impossible to say with precision. The monastery holds no instruments for measuring the night in the way the modern world understands measurement. No numerals glowing from a distant surface, no quiet vibration beneath a pillow. Time within these walls is not calculated, it is inhabited. And in the dormitory, where a dozen monks breathe in slow, unconscious rhythm upon their narrow palates, time has dissolved entirely into something formless and dark. The room around you is almost completely without light. A single oil lamp, burning very low, casts a faint amber wash across the far end of the dormitory, enough to distinguish shape from shadow, but little more. The walls are stone. The floor is stone. Even the ceiling, if you were awake to look upward, would offer nothing but the cold certainty of stone. Outside, the sky is the color of iron. The stars, were you able to see them, would be extraordinary.
the kind of stars that only reveal themselves when no competing light exists for many miles in any direction. The air above the monastery walls, cold and entirely clean, would carry a firmament so dense with light that it would seem almost solid. Ancient astronomers named that brightness the Via Lactea, the Milky Way, and in the pre-industrial world it was simply a feature of every clear night, as familiar and as unremarkable as the moon. But you cannot see it. You are inside. You are asleep. And then there is the bell. It does not ease you toward wakefulness with gentle suggestion. It does not offer transition. The bell of a Benedictine monastery is not a soft thing. It rings with absolute authority, a single, clear, insistent tone that travels through the dormitory walls as though the walls were not there at all. It rings once, then again, then again. It is, in every sense of the word, a summons. The hour is approximately 2 in the morning.
You have lived within these walls long enough. If you are a monk of some years standing, shaped by this routine as stone is shaped by water, you will not have been entirely surprised by the bell. Some part of you, even in the depths of sleep, will have been anticipating it. The body, over time, accommodates itself to what the rule requires, not without resistance, but with a certain resigned familiarity that is its own quiet form of obedience. You rise. The Rule of Saint Benedict, composed in the 6th century by the Italian monk whose name it carries, is a document of remarkable practical wisdom. It governs nearly every dimension of the monastic day: what food is to be taken and in what quantity, how silence is to be observed in the refectory, how a brother who has erred is to be corrected, how guests are to be welcomed at the monastery gate. It is a text that has been called, without exaggeration, one of the most influential administrative documents in Western history. Thousands of monasteries, across more than 15 centuries, have ordered their common life according to its provisions.
And among those provisions, the matter of prayer is central. Benedict divided the day into 8 canonical hours, what the Church calls the divine office, or the opus Dei, the work of God. These were vigils, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. Together, they formed a complete architecture of prayer around which all other activity, labor, study, eating, sleep, was arranged as secondary. Most of these hours belong to the waking day, but one does not. Vigils, known also as the night office and in later tradition as matins, was the great nocturnal prayer. Benedict was specific on this point, calibrating the hour of rising to the season. In his calculation, using the ancient reckoning of night divided into 12 equal parts, the monks were to rise in the 8th hour of the night. Depending upon the season and the particular lineage of interpretation, this placed vigils somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning. For the purposes of this chapter, we will set that bell at 2 o'clock. The experience of waking at 2 in the morning is unlike the experience of waking at any other hour.
At dawn, the body cooperates. Light filters through the eyelids with increasing warmth. The world announces itself in gradual increments. Birdsong, the distant sounds of other lives, the slow brightening of everything. The transition from sleep to wakefulness at dawn is, for most people, a negotiated one. The body moves toward it willingly because its deeper chemistry has been preparing for it for hours. At 2 in the morning, there is no such cooperation. The body at this hour is at or very near its lowest physiological point. Core temperature has fallen toward its nightly minimum. Heart rate is slow and steady in the way that suggests genuine rest rather than mere stillness. The hormones that orient the body toward activity, the cortisol that begins to rise before true dawn, the accumulated energy that follows a full night's sleep, are nowhere near their moment. To be pulled from sleep at 2 in the morning is, in biological terms, to be removed from a place of profound rest before the work of that rest is complete. The monks knew this, of course, though they would not have described it in those terms. What they knew was simpler and colder.
The dormitory at 2 in the morning is cold. Even in the height of summer, the stone walls hold a chill that human warmth alone cannot fully displace. In winter, and we should resist any impulse to romanticize a medieval winter in a monastery of the 6th or 7th or 8th century, the cold is formidable. The breath fogs upon leaving the body. The hands, emerging from beneath the rough woolen blanket, ache almost immediately. The feet, placed upon the stone floor, register the temperature with an immediacy that no amount of habit entirely softens. And yet, the monk does not linger. The rule makes this expectation clear. Benedict's instructions on the matter of rising are characteristically precise. The monks are to rise without delay. They are to dress efficiently and without confusion. And here the rule provides a detail of considerable practical wisdom. The brothers are to sleep in their habits, not in separate night garments, not in a state of undress, but clothed, belted, and sandaled, or at minimum prepared to dress within moments of waking. The rationale is transparent. A man who must search in darkness for scattered clothing is a man who might, in that searching, find reasons to sit upon the edge of his pallet and wait for the impulse toward obedience to return. Benedict understood the temptation of delay. He acknowledges it in the rule with a candor that is unexpectedly affecting across the gap of 15 centuries. He knew that there would be brothers who were slow to rise, not from malice, but from the simple weight of sleep upon a human body. He writes that the monks should encourage one another in the rising, offering mutual support to any who lag behind. The tone is not punitive, it is practical, and beneath the practicality there is something almost tender. This is a rule composed by a man who had himself stood in a cold dormitory at 2 in the morning, willing his feet toward the floor. And so the dormitory stirs. In near silence, bodies rise one by one from their narrow pallets. The rule governs speech in the night hours with particular strictness, and so there is very little sound, only the soft movement of fabric, the muted percussion of sandals found and fitted, the quiet assistance offered between one brother and another when age or illness makes rising slow. They move, then, through the darkness toward the church.
Consider that procession for a moment. Imagine it as though from some elevated vantage, from the cloister walk above the courtyard, perhaps, or from the gate through which the world outside very occasionally intrudes. A column of figures, robed and quiet, moving through corridors of stone in the light of a single carried lamp. Their breath rises and disperses. Their sandals make the softest of sounds. They move with the unhurried purpose of people who have made this same journey at this same hour so many hundreds of times that the route has become something deeper than habit, something close to instinct. Where the route crosses an open courtyard, the cold is complete. The sky above is vast and indifferent and extraordinary. In every direction, for as far as any human sense can reach, there is darkness. Not the moderated darkness of a city at night, threaded through with the amber light of 1,000 electric sources, but the absolute, unmediated darkness of a world that has not yet been illuminated. The stars do their ancient work overhead, and beneath them, these small human figures move toward the one lit threshold in an otherwise dark world.
The church door opens. Inside, the smell is immediate and familiar. Cold stone, the residue of incense from a previous office, the particular sweetness of beeswax candles burning slowly in still air. The monks take their places in the choir stalls, facing one another across the central aisle, row upon row, in the arrangement that has not changed since this building first received them. Someone lights the candles at the altar. Someone opens the great book. And then, in the cold and the candlelight and the profound silence of a monastery at 2 a.m, the office begins. Vigils, as Benedict prescribed it, was not a brief exercise. On ordinary ferial nights, the weekdays of the liturgical calendar, uncelebrated and unremarkable, the office consisted of 12 psalms sung antiphonally between the two sides of the choir, followed by readings drawn from Scripture or from the writings of the Fathers of the Church. On Sundays and on the great feasts, the births and deaths and transformations of the saints, the cycles of Advent and Lent and Eastertide, the office expanded considerably. There were additional canticles, further readings, a hymn sung before the psalms, the gradual accumulation of liturgical weight that the Church understood as appropriate to the dignity of the day.
The psalms themselves deserved more than a passing acknowledgement. The Book of Psalms, that ancient collection of Hebrew poetry, composed across many centuries and many hands, gathered into its present form perhaps 500 years before the birth of Christ, was the beating heart of monastic prayer. Benedict expected his monks to know all 150 psalms by memory, not as an academic achievement, but as a lived interior reality, so that in any moment, in darkness, in exhaustion, in grief, in the strange half-consciousness of a 2 o'clock rising, the words would surface from somewhere beneath deliberate thought, requiring no page, no lamp, no act of will. Psalm 63, often appointed for the night hours, begins with words that, in this context, lose their metaphorical distance entirely. O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you. Standing in the cold of the church at 2 a.m, with the weight of sleep still present in the limbs and the body straining toward wakefulness, that thirst was not a figure of speech. It was an accurate description of a human being reaching, with considerable effort, toward something vast and quiet and not fully comprehensible. The psalms were sung in alternation, one side of the choir taking a verse, the other responding. The sound of this, in a stone church with a vaulted ceiling, would have been unlike anything in our ordinary experience. Not dramatic, not particularly beautiful in any conventional sense, but continuous, measured, and in some deep way settling, as though the act of giving voice to these ancient words in this ancient alternation at this ancient hour was itself a kind of work that the universe required. There is a theology behind the hour of vigils that is worth pausing upon, even briefly. In the ancient world, before the invention of artificial light,
The night was divided into watches, intervals of time assigned to soldiers, to sentinels, to those whose duty required wakefulness while others slept. The Gospels speak of this division. In the parable of the faithful servants, Christ says, "Blessed are those servants whom the master finds awake when he comes, whether in the second watch or the third." For a first-century audience, this imagery required no explanation. Everyone understood the structure of the night. Everyone knew what it meant to keep a watch. Vigils was, in part, a liturgical enactment of this watchfulness.
The monks rose, not because rest was unavailable. They rose because they chose, night after night, through cold and illness and age and the ordinary weight of human weariness, to interrupt their sleep with prayer, to stand at their post, to be awake when the rest of the world was not. This was understood as a form of spiritual discipline, unlike any that the daylight hours could provide, because it cost something that daylight practice does not. It cost rest. It cost warmth. It cost the particular ease of a body that has been allowed to sleep through. Benedict, however, was not interested in suffering for its own sake.
His rule, for all its demands, was composed by a man who believed that the spiritual life must be made sustainable for human beings, not merely for exceptional ones. He writes, with a directness that is characteristic of him, that he does not wish to burden his brothers too heavily. He adjusted the length of vigils according to the season, giving more prayer in the long nights of winter and less in the abbreviated nights of summer. He made provision for those of fragile constitution, for the very young and the very old. He was at his foundation a shepherd of actual people, and he knew that a sheep driven too hard will not follow. The bell rang. The monks rose. They prayed, in the cold, in the dark, together. And then, and this is the detail that belongs most intimately to this hour and to this chapter, they returned to sleep.
After vigils, in the practice of many Benedictine communities, there was a period of rest before the next canonical hour, lauds, which fell at or near first light. This interval, sometimes an hour in length and sometimes slightly longer, was understood within the community as a gift, a restoration, a second sleep. We have spoken in earlier chapters of the ancient human practice of divided sleep, that natural pattern, well documented among pre-industrial peoples, in which the night was experienced not as a single continuous duration, but as two distinct periods of rest, separated by an interval of quiet wakefulness. Vigils, in a remarkable sense, gave institutional form to this pattern. The monks were not, in rising at 2 and returning to their pallets by 4, working against their biology. They may, in fact, have been working with it, aligning the demands of the liturgy with the deepest rhythms of the human body.
In that brief space between the end of vigils and the beginning of dawn, the monks returned to the dormitory in silence. No fires were lit, no words were exchanged. Each man returned to his pallet, drew his rough blanket close, and allowed the second sleep, that quieter, lighter, more permeable sleep of the early morning hours, to receive him once more. As you listen to these words, you are perhaps already somewhere within that territory. The world beyond your walls is still. Your body is warm. Whatever bell has marked the hours of your own day has long since fallen silent.
And in this quiet space, in this ancient, unhurried pocket of the night, there is nothing at all that is required of you.
No cold stone waits beneath bare feet. No office remains to be kept. The watch has been held. In whatever private and wordless way the sleeping mind holds its own vigil, attending, without language or effort, to the great and quiet thing at the center of every breathing life. That is enough. The second sleep is already here, if you will allow it. Let it come.
The monks return to the dormitory in silence. They file back through the corridors in the same quiet column in which they departed, their sandals making the same soft sounds upon the same cold stone. The candles they carried on the way to the church are extinguished now, or carried still, small points of warmth moving through the dark. They take their places beside their pallets. They remove their sandals, and one by one, with the particular efficiency of people who have no interest in prolonging their exposure to the cold, they lie back down. The blanket, when it closes over the body again, is an extraordinary thing. It is rough wool, nothing more, coarse against the skin, smelling faintly of the animal it once belonged to. By any standard of the modern world, it is an inadequate covering. And yet, in the particular context of this return, the body still cool from the church, the feet still carrying the memory of stone floors, the mind still resonating with the last psalm sung in the candlelight, that rough blanket is something very close to grace. The body settles. The dormitory falls quiet once more. The sleep that follows the night office is not the same sleep that preceded it. First sleep, the sleep that carries the monk from Compline through to the bell at 2, is deep and largely dreamless in its early stages, dominated by those long, slow waves of physiological restoration that the body requires above all else. It is, in the language of modern sleep science, heavily weighted towards slow wave sleep, the kind that repairs tissue, consolidates memory, regulates the immune system, and returns the wearied body to something approaching equilibrium. Second sleep is a different country entirely. By the time the monks return to their pallets after vigils, somewhere between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, the body's most urgent requirements have already been addressed. The deep repair has been accomplished. What remains as sleep returns now is lighter, more varied, more richly textured with imagery. This is the territory of the dreaming mind, the period of sleep that the modern world would recognize as REM abundant, characterized by its rapid eye movements, its vivid interior narratives, its particular sensitivity to the sounds and sensations of the waking world just beyond the border of consciousness. To lie down into second sleep is to lie down into something permeable. The body rests, but the mind, in its own way, is not entirely still. The existence of this divided sleep, first sleep and second sleep, as two distinct and recognized phases of the night, is not a construction of modern science. It is an ancient and widely documented human reality, one that the historian A. Roger Eckerch spent many years recovering from the documentary record. In his landmark work on the history of the night, Eckhart assembled evidence from sources spanning centuries and cultures. Legal documents, diaries, medical texts, works of literature, court records, household accounts. What he found, accumulated across hundreds of sources, was a consistent and unremarkable reference to two sleeps as simply the ordinary architecture of the human night. People went to bed at dark, slept for several hours, woke naturally in the middle of the night, spent an hour or so in quiet wakefulness, and then returned to a second sleep that carried them toward dawn.
This interval between the two sleeps was not, in the pre-industrial world, experienced as insomnia. It was not experienced as a problem requiring remedy. It was simply part of the night, a time for quiet thought, for prayer, for intimate conversation, for the small private activities that the compressed daylight hours did not permit. Medieval physicians recommended it as a good time for marital relations because the body was rested but not yet committed to the demands of the day. Priests suggested it as an appropriate hour for personal prayer, for the examination of conscience, for bringing the concerns of the sleeping heart before God.
The monastic timetable, with its bell at 2 and its return to rest by 4, did not impose segmented sleep upon the monks. It recognized it. It gave it purpose. And in doing so, it aligned the most demanding liturgical obligation of the day with the natural waking point of a body that had been sleeping since dark. The monks, rising for vigils, may not have been fighting their nature at all. They may, in some profound sense, have simply been honoring it.
Consider, then, the monastery at 4 o'clock in the morning. The office is finished. The monks are returned to their pallets. The lamp at the end of the dormitory burns at its lowest point. Barely enough light to distinguish the sleeping forms from the shadows that lie between them. Outside, nothing moves. There are no carts upon the road, because there is no road nearby. There are no animals in the fields, making the sounds that animals make when they sense the approach of light, because the light has not yet approached. The birds are entirely silent.
The hour between 3 and 5 in the morning is, in almost every environment on Earth, the quietest of the 24. Sound travels differently in the cold. The human world, which generates its noise through movement and intention, has not yet begun to move or intend. Even the natural world seems to observe a kind of collective pause, a breath held in the interval between the deep night and the first intimation of morning. In the monastery, that quietude is total. The stone walls do not vibrate with distant traffic. The air does not carry the hum of 1,000 machines performing their invisible functions. The only sound, if you were present to listen for it, would be the sound of breathing, the slow, unconscious rhythm of sleeping men, and beneath that, perhaps, the very faint movement of air through a narrow window somewhere above the courtyard. It is the deepest silence of the entire night. And into that silence, the monks dream. The monastic tradition's relationship with dreams was, to put it carefully, complicated. On one hand, the biblical inheritance was rich with divinely significant dreams.
Joseph, son of Jacob, dreamed in symbols that foretold the fate of nations. The prophet Daniel received visions in the night. The wise men of the Nativity narrative were warned away from Herod through a dream. In the scriptural tradition, the sleeping mind was an acknowledged channel through which something greater than the ordinary self might speak. On the other hand, the fathers of the Church and the monastic tradition that followed them were deeply cautious about dreams. The devil, in their theological understanding, was not inactive during the hours of sleep. The unguarded mind was understood to be vulnerable in precisely the way that the waking, disciplined mind was not. Dreams of pride, of lust, of violence, of spiritual grandeur, all of these were recognized as potential instruments of temptation rather than revelation. John Cassian, whose writings influenced Benedict profoundly, devoted considerable attention to the discernment of dreams. His conclusion was, broadly, one of wariness, that the monk should neither dismiss all dreams as meaningless noise, nor receive any dream as unambiguous divine communication, but should hold each vision of the night with a kind of sober, attentive suspicion.
Benedict himself does not speak at length about dreams in the Rule, but the tradition he inherited made the matter clear enough. The monk who woke from a vivid or troubling dream was expected to bring it, in the appropriate moment, to his abbot, not to dwell upon it privately, not to assign it significance without counsel, but to submit it to the scrutiny of a wiser and more experienced mind. And yet, for all this caution, the dreams continued. They always do. What did those dreams contain in the hour after vigils? It is impossible, of course, to know with certainty. The sleeping minds of Benedictine monks in the 7th century left no record of their interior imagery. But we can observe something that modern sleep research makes very clear. The dreaming mind does not generate its material from nothing. It works with what has been most recently and most intensely present to the waking mind. It takes the textures and images and sounds of recent experience and reorganizes them into the fluid narratives of sleep.
The monks had spent the previous hour singing psalms in a candlelit church. The images of that hour, the amber light, the cold air, the sound of voices in alternation, the specific words of specific psalms, would have been among the most vivid and emotionally resonant material available to the dreaming mind. The words of Psalm 63, "My soul thirsts for you as in a dry and weary land where there is no water," do not simply disappear when the office ends. They descend. They find their way into the deeper registers of awareness and continue their work there, transformed by the strange alchemy of dream into something no longer verbal, no longer liturgical, but still in some way oriented in the same direction. The monks prayed in the candlelight, and then they carried that prayer, unknowing, into sleep. Outside the monastery walls, the sky is changing. Not visibly, not yet. The darkness at 4:30 in the morning appears, to any ordinary examination, to be the same darkness it was at 2. There is no color yet in the east, no softening of the horizon, no birds lifting from their nighttime positions with the purposeful restlessness that signals an imminent dawn. But the darkness is not the same. Something in the quality of the air is different, imperceptibly, molecularly different. The temperature, which fell steadily through the night, has reached its lowest point and begun, by the smallest of fractions, to rise. The stars in the western sky are exactly as they were, but somewhere below the horizon, in a direction the sleeping monks cannot see,
The light is gathering. It is not yet dawn, but it is the preparation for dawn, the long, invisible work that precedes the visible event by more time than most people realize. The night is turning. This is the hour that has no name in ordinary life. Not night in its full and settled sense, not morning, which carries with it the implication of beginning and activity and intention. Something between, a threshold in the original meaning of that word. The place where one thing ends and another is not yet begun. The space in which the transition itself can be felt, if one is still enough to feel it.
The monks are still enough. They do not know in their sleep that the sky beyond the walls is performing this quiet transformation. They do not need to know. Their bodies know it in the way that all bodies know it, as a very faint shift in the quality of sleep, a barely perceptible movement toward the surface of consciousness that will not become waking for another hour yet. They float within that movement. They are neither here nor there. They are, in the most precise and literal sense, resting in the threshold. And so are you. If you have been listening to these words for any length of time, if you have followed the monks from Compline to Vigils and back again, if you have heard the bell and felt the cold of the dormitory floor and stood for a moment in the candle-lit church at 2 a.m, then you have done, in your own way, something similar. You have kept a kind of watch. And now the watch is over.
The bell will not ring again for a while yet. The sky beyond your walls is doing whatever the sky does at this hour, darkening still, or already beginning in some almost undetectable way to change. Your body knows the difference between these hours, even when your mind does not. It has always known. There is nothing required of you in this space. No movement, no intention, no preparation for whatever the day will eventually bring. There is only the particular warmth of a body that has earned its rest, the particular quiet of a world that has not yet begun. And underneath both of those, underneath the warmth and the quiet, something older and slower and more continuous than either. Let it carry you. The second sleep is here. You are already within it.
Stone holds cold the way that memory holds grief. Not dramatically, not with any outward sign, but thoroughly, persistently, in a way that makes its presence felt long after the original source has passed. A medieval monastery in winter was, in its entirety, an exercise in that kind of cold. The church was stone, the dormitory was stone, the cloister walk, that covered corridor through which the monks moved between one obligation and the next, was open on one side to whatever weather the season produced, and stone on all others. The chapter house, where the community gathered each morning for the reading of the rule and the administration of daily business, was stone. The scriptorium, where monks bent over manuscripts in the thin light of narrow windows, was stone. The refectory, where 2 meals were taken each day in silence while a reader read aloud from the lectern, was stone. The kitchen alone had fire, and the kitchen was not a place of rest. To live in a medieval monastery was to live in an architecture designed with purposes other than warmth. The cloister was designed for contemplation. The church was designed for the worship of God. The
The dormitory was designed for sleep sufficient to sustain prayer. Comfort, in the sense that the modern world understands it, the sense of a body at ease in a temperature calibrated to its preference, was not among the design priorities. There was, however, one exception. In the southeast corner of the cloister, in most Benedictine and Cistercian houses of the medieval period, there was a room unlike any other in the complex. It was not large. It was not, by any elaborate standard, beautiful. Its walls were the same stone as every other wall. Its floor was the same stone as every other floor. Its windows were narrow, its ceiling vaulted, its furnishings minimal. But it had a fireplace. This room was called the Calefactory, from the Latin calefacere, to make warm. In English, it appears in historical records under various names: the warming room, the warming house, the calefactorium. Whatever its designation in a particular community, its function was singular and unmistakable. It was the one room in the monastery where fire was maintained not for cooking, not for smithing, not for any instrumental purpose, but simply for warmth. The fire in the Calefactory was lit, in most communities, at a fixed point in the liturgical year, typically around the Feast of All Saints in early November, and maintained continuously through the cold months until the return of the spring warmth made it unnecessary. In the most severe climates of northern Europe, that fire might burn for 5 months without interruption. In the more temperate south, the season was shorter, though the principle remained the same. Someone was responsible for that fire. Someone rose before the community to lay the wood and coax the flame and ensure that when the monks arrived, the warmth was waiting.
It is worth pausing here to consider Benedict's attitude toward the body, because the Calefactory is, in a meaningful sense, an expression of that attitude. Benedict was not an ascetic in the manner of some earlier monastic traditions. He did not believe that the body was an enemy to be punished into submission. He did not prescribe prolonged fasting, extreme cold, or the deliberate embrace of physical suffering as instruments of spiritual advancement. The Egyptian desert fathers, whose practices he knew well, had developed disciplines of bodily deprivation that Benedict regarded with a mixture of respect and caution. He admired their devotion. He did not think it universally applicable. In the prologue to the Rule, he writes that he hopes to establish nothing harsh, nothing burdensome. His monastery is to be a school for the Lord's service, and in a school, the teacher's task is to make learning possible, not to make it unbearable. The weak are to be accommodated alongside the strong. The elderly and the young are to have their particular needs considered. Adequate food, adequate sleep, adequate clothing, these are not concessions to weakness in Benedict's understanding. They are the reasonable provision of a shepherd who wants his flock to survive the journey. The Calefactory, then, is not an anomaly. It is an expression of a philosophy. The monks are cold. The body has limits. There is a room with a fire. Go and warm yourselves.
Access to the Calefactory was regulated, as everything in the monastic life was regulated. It was not a common room in any relaxed sense. The monks did not drift in and out at will, settling into corner positions with the unhurried ease of people with time to spare. The rule governed their movements too carefully for that. In most communities, the Calefactory was available during specific intervals, primarily in the hours between the early morning offices, and again during the afternoon work period in the coldest months. A monk who had completed his appointed labor, or who waited in the interval between lauds and prime, might proceed to the warming room for a brief period before the next obligation called him elsewhere. The fire was there. The warmth was available, but it was warmth within a frame, warmth offered in measured portions, like everything else the monastery offered. The sign language that many communities developed to navigate the silence of the cloister was employed here as in any other shared space. A monk needing to communicate with a brother might gesture rather than speak, a raised hand, a tilted head, the small vocabulary of necessary exchange conducted without words. Some communities permitted a more relaxed silence in the Calefactory than in the church or refectory, allowing quiet speech in genuine need. Others maintained the full strictness of the Great Silence throughout. The particulars varied. The warmth did not.
And the warmth. Let us stay with the warmth for a moment. The fire in the Calefactory was, by practical necessity, a substantial one. A small fire in a stone room of any size produces very little usable heat. The fireplace, typically built into the end wall, sometimes large enough to take logs of considerable length, would have burned oak or beech or whatever timber the monastery's land supplied. The fire that resulted was not ornamental. It was serious. It produced genuine heat and light and the particular complex of sensory experience that fire has always produced in the human animal. The sound of it first, the specific vocabulary of a wood fire, the low percussion of shifting logs, the intermittent crack of a knot releasing its trapped gas, the soft, continuous voice of flame at work. These sounds carry a particular quality of company. They suggest presence without demanding anything of you. They are, in a way that has never been fully explained, among the most settling sounds available to human perception. People have always known this, even before they had the language to articulate it. Then the heat itself, arriving not all at once, but in stages, beginning at the face and hands and working inward. Cold hands held before a fire do not warm instantly. There is a moment of increased discomfort first, as the returning circulation makes itself known, and then, gradually, the ache recedes. The fingers become recognizably one's own again. The face softens. Something in the posture that cold produces, the involuntary contraction, the pulled-in quality of a body defending its core temperature, releases.
The smell of wood smoke, the orange light cast across the vaulted stone ceiling, the way the shadows move, not randomly, but with a coherent life of their own, as though the room were inhabited by something attentive and benign. To sit near a fire after hours of cold is to experience one of the oldest available forms of relief. The monks knew this in their bodies in the same way that every human being who has ever been cold and then warm has known it. Not philosophically, not theologically, simply and completely as a fact of having a body in a world that contains fire. There is something worth saying about fire and human history that extends well beyond the monastery walls. For most of the time that human beings have existed as a distinct kind of creature, the vast preponderance of the years, stretching back hundreds of thousands before the first monastery was built, fire was the center. Not metaphorically the center, literally and practically the center of any human shelter, any human gathering, any human night. People arranged themselves around fires. They fed them, tended them, protected them from rain and wind. They told their stories beside them. They fell asleep watching them. They woke in the night to a dying fire and felt the specific unease of a warmth that required attention. The monks of a 6th century Benedictine monastery were not distant from that deep inheritance. They wore different clothing and inhabited different structures and organized their nights according to a written rule rather than the rhythms of a nomadic life. But when they entered the Calefactory and stood before the fire with their cold hands extended toward the heat, they participated in something that no amount of theological refinement had altered or could alter.
They were human beings beside a fire. That continuity is, in its quiet way, remarkable. The same gesture, hands extended, palms open toward the source of warmth, performed for hundreds of thousands of years before that particular morning, and for many thousands of years since. The posture of the warming monk is the posture of every human being who has ever been cold. It requires no translation across time. The Cistercians, who emerged in the late 11th century as a reform movement within the Benedictine tradition, brought their characteristic severity to many aspects of monastic practice. They simplified the liturgy, stripped the architecture, reduced the ornamentation of churches to bare stone and plain glass. In their earlier, more austere houses, the Calefactory was sometimes restricted further, its season shortened, its hours of access reduced. The Cistercian ideal, particularly in the time of Bernard of Clairvaux, tended toward a more deliberate embrace of physical hardship than Benedict's original rule required. And yet, even the Cistercians kept the warming room. Even in the most austere interpretation of the monastic vocation, someone understood that a community of human beings cannot function indefinitely in unbroken cold. That warmth, periodically restored, is not a luxury, but a minimum. That the body which has been warmed can pray and work and attend with a quality of presence that the body numb with cold cannot sustain. The fire remained in every house through every reform.
Eventually, the morning interval ends. The bell sounds for the next office, or the work horn calls the monks to their appointed tasks. The Calefactory empties, one by one, as quietly as it filled. The last monk rises from his position near the fire, turns toward the door, and passes through it back into the cold corridor. The chill is immediate. It always is when warmth ends. The contrast makes the cold feel sharper than it did before, which is not a failure of the warmth, but simply the nature of contrast itself. The body, having been reminded of what it is to be comfortable, registers the discomfort of the cold more precisely. The monk wraps his habit closer, tucks his hands within its folds, and proceeds toward whatever the day requires. He will return to the Calefactory. Not today, perhaps. Tomorrow, or the day after. The fire will be there. And here, in this quiet chapter, we find a kind of completion that does not announce itself as such. You, listening now, are in your own version of that room. Perhaps there is no fire. Perhaps the warmth that surrounds you is of a different and more ordinary kind. But you are warm, where the world outside is cold or dark or indifferent. You are inside, where the night cannot quite reach you. Your body, like those of the monks settling beside the Calefactory fire after the long cold of the night offices, has found its temperature, has found its ease. This is not a small thing.
The impulse toward warmth that the Calefactory satisfied, that specific bodily relief of cold becoming warm, of outside becoming inside, of hardship giving way to something gentler, is one of the oldest and most continuous threads in human experience. It runs from the earliest fire-lit shelters of the prehistoric dark, through every monastery and farmhouse and dwelling of every kind that human beings have ever built. It runs without interruption to this room, to this moment, to the particular warmth of where you are right now. Let that warmth hold you. There is no cold waiting on the other side of this, no bell, no corridor, no office requiring your attention. Only the warmth and the quiet and the gradual deepening of rest. Stay for a while beside the fire.
There are no light switches in a 6th century monastery. This fact, stated plainly, contains within it a world of implication that the modern mind must make a deliberate effort to enter. We live in a civilization so thoroughly illuminated that the idea of genuine darkness, not the moderated dark of a bedroom with curtains drawn, not the partial dark of a city street at 3 in the morning, but the complete and unmediated darkness of a world without electrical light, has become largely theoretical. We know abstractly that such darkness exists. We have perhaps encountered it briefly in a rural field or a forest at night and felt something close to surprise at its completeness. The monks of a Benedictine monastery in the early medieval period did not encounter darkness as a surprise. They lived inside it for a significant portion of every year. When the sun withdrew, the day ended. Torches and oil lamps and beeswax candles extended the usable hours by some small measure, but only some. Light was expensive. It was produced by burning things that had to be grown or gathered or purchased. It was conserved with care. And it was, at its best, a local and limited intervention in the vast surrounding dark. The seasons in this world were not background conditions. They were the primary fact of life.
Benedict understood this with the practical clarity of a man who had lived by it his entire life. The rule addresses the question of seasonal variation in the night offices with a directness that is characteristic of its author. Benedict was aware, keenly, practically aware, that the night in December is not the same as the night in June. In the northern latitudes, where most of his monasteries eventually took root, the difference was substantial. A summer night in the British Isles or northern France might offer only 5 or 6 hours of genuine darkness. A winter night in the same location might offer 17 or more. To impose an identical liturgical structure upon nights of such different character would have been, in Benedict's estimation, a form of unreason. And so the rule adjusts. In winter, when the nights are long, Vigils is extended. Additional readings are appointed. A canticle is added. The office expands to fill more of the available darkness because the darkness itself is generous. In summer, when the nights are short and the interval between vigils and lauds barely exists, Vigils is shortened, and any remaining time is to be given over to the reading of psalms or scripture by those monks who require further memorization. Nothing is wasted, but neither is anything forced beyond what the season permits. The office breathes. It expands in the long nights and contracts in the short ones, following the rhythm of the earth with a fidelity that no fixed schedule could replicate. A winter night in the medieval monastery was a different experience in almost every way from its summer counterpart. The darkness was earlier and later, arriving before Vespers in the deepest months, persisting well past lauds. The cold was settled and serious, the kind that inhabited the stone walls as thoroughly as the cold of a cave. The fires in the Calefactory burned longer and were more urgently sought.
The world beyond the monastery walls retreated into a stillness that summer never quite achieved. The fields empty, the roads largely impassable, the occasional traveler a rarity rather than an interruption. But there was also this, more sleep. The winter night, precisely because it was so long, offered the monks more hours of rest than the summer permitted. Between Compline, which fell at full dark, perhaps 5 o'clock on a December evening, and the bell for Vigils at 2 in the morning, there were 9 hours. 9 hours during which the dormitory lay in unbroken darkness, and the bodies of the monks, responding to the cold and the absence of light with the biological directives that winter always activates, tended naturally toward longer and deeper rest. The body in winter sleeps differently. Modern sleep researchers working with subjects removed from artificial light have documented this repeatedly. In conditions of natural seasonal darkness, human sleep patterns shift. People sleep longer in winter, not because they are lazier or less disciplined, but because the biology of sleep is responsive to light in ways that override intention. The shortened days reduce the stimulating effect of bright light upon the waking brain. The longer nights allow the sleep-promoting hormones to operate across a wider window. The body, offered genuine darkness for 17 hours, does not insist on filling all 17 with wakefulness. The monks were not fighting this. They were inside it.
The deepest point of the winter year, the solstice in late December, carried a weight in the medieval monastic calendar that extended well beyond the astronomical. In the Christian liturgical year, the weeks surrounding the solstice constitute the season of Advent, a word derived from the Latin adventus, meaning arrival or coming. Advent is, among other things, a season of darkness waiting for light. It is a time of watching, of patient anticipation, of sitting with the knowledge that the light has not yet come, but that it will come. The theological content of the season and its astronomical context were not incidental to one another. They were, in the understanding of the medieval church, in profound correspondence. The monks observed the solstice not as an astronomical fact requiring notation, but as a liturgical reality requiring response. The longest night was not simply the longest night, it was the darkness at its fullest extent, the moment of maximum waiting. And in the days that followed, as the nights began their imperceptible shortening, each incremental return of light was understood as a kind of promise being kept. To live by natural light, to have no recourse to the switch on the wall, no ability to simply override the darkness by an act of will, was to feel the solstice in a way that the modern world can only approximate. The monks felt it in their bodies, in the length of their sleep, in the cold that peaked around those weeks and then slowly, and not yet convincingly, began to ease. It is worth considering for a moment how completely the seasons shaped the texture of the monastic interior life. Summer brought long days of agricultural labor. The monastery farms required tending, the harvest required gathering, the animals required care. The monks who worked outdoors in summer moved through the offices with the specific tiredness of physical exertion, their vigils perhaps colored by the deep sleep of bodies genuinely spent. Winter contracted the world inward. Agricultural work slowed or stopped. The monks moved to the scriptorium, to manuscript copying, to study, to the indoor occupations that required light but not warmth, huddled over their writing in the thin gray illumination of a narrow window, breath fogging, fingers moving carefully across vellum. The whole rhythm of the year was a single slow breathing, expansion in summer, contraction in winter. The liturgy followed this breathing, the sleep followed it. The quality of attention that the monks brought to their prayer followed it, shaped by the season the way water is shaped by the vessel it occupies.
After the solstice, the return of light was gradual, so gradual that weeks passed before it became consciously perceptible. But the body registered it before the mind did. Sleep shortened incrementally. The bell for vigils arrived against a darkness that was, by February, marginally less absolute than it had been in December. The Feast of Candlemas, celebrated on the 2nd of February, marked the point at which the return of light received its liturgical acknowledgement. Candles were brought to the church to be blessed, an act whose symbolism required no explanation in a world that knew, with practical intimacy, what it meant to run out of light. The blessed candles would be carried home and kept, lit in moments of illness or fear or approaching death. They were the light that the community would carry into whatever darkness the year still held. The winter was not over, but its authority was diminishing. You are somewhere in your own year as you listen to this. Perhaps it is winter where you are, the darkness outside genuine and early, the cold in the window glass, the particular and closed quality of a house sealed against the night. Or perhaps it is another season, and the darkness comes later and is less complete, and the warmth outside is something other than a memory. Wherever you are, the season has shaped this night more than you may have considered. Your body knows what season it is. It has always known. It registers the length of the available light with mechanisms older than any monastery, older than any rule, older than any written account of how human beings have managed their nights. The cells respond to darkness the way flowers respond to sun, not with decision, but with the deep, unconscious compliance of living things following the conditions they were made for. The monks had no choice but to live seasonally. The darkness was not optional. The cold was not optional. The long winter nights that stretched from Compline to Vigils and beyond were simply what winter was, and the rule accommodated itself to winter because there was no alternative worth considering. But there was something in that accommodation, something in the willingness to let the season determine the shape of the night that was not merely pragmatic. It was a form of attentiveness, a recognition that the human body does not exist outside the natural world, but within it, that to sleep well is, in part, to sleep seasonally, to allow the darkness, whatever darkness the current night offers, to do what darkness has always done. Let this night be what it is. Let it be long or short, cold or mild, winter or otherwise. You are already, in the most important sense, in the right season. Consider the mathematics of it. Every night, without exception, for the entirety of a monk's active life within the monastery, interrupted. The bell at 2, the cold floor, the church, the psalms, the return to the pallet, the second sleep. And then, before that second sleep has run its full course, the bell again at dawn for lauds. Every night. For 30 years, some of them. For 40. For the duration of whatever span of life the body could sustain within that frame. There is no single night of interrupted sleep that defeats a human being. The body is more resilient than that, and more accommodating. One broken night produces fatigue, diminished concentration, a certain gray quality to the edges of experience that a full night's rest will largely repair. We know this. We have all known it. But the accumulation is another matter entirely. Weeks of interrupted sleep produce something that simple fatigue does not, a kind of erosion, not dramatic, not sudden, but steady and cumulative, the way that water erodes stone. The sharpness of thought softens, the body's resistance to illness, normally a quiet and invisible system working in the background of every waking hour, begins to function with less than its full capacity. The inflammation that the sleeping body ordinarily manages and suppresses finds more purchase. The joints, which rely on the restorative chemistry of deep sleep for their maintenance, register the shortfall over months and years in ways that eventually become visible. The monks felt this. They could not have articulated it in the language of cortisol and cytokines, but they felt it.
Modern sleep science is unambiguous on the consequences of chronic sleep interruption, and the picture it presents is not a gentle one. Sleep is not passive. It is among the most metabolically active states the human body enters, a period of intensive biological maintenance during which the immune system mobilizes, the brain clears accumulated metabolic waste through the glymphatic system, cellular repair occurs at rates impossible during waking, and the hormonal architecture of the body is recalibrated for the demands of another day. When that process is interrupted, not occasionally, but structurally, night after night, the shortfall compounds. Chronic sleep fragmentation is associated in the modern research literature with elevated inflammatory markers, reduced immune response, accelerated cellular aging, impaired glucose regulation, and a measurable decline in the kind of sustained cognitive attention that the monastic life, with its demands of careful memorization and contemplative prayer, required above almost everything else. The irony is quiet but real. The very schedule designed to deepen the monk's spiritual life may, over time, have dulled the instrument through which that life was lived.
The medieval world did not lack for understanding of sleep's importance, though it described that importance through a different vocabulary. The dominant medical tradition in the medieval monastery drew from Galen, the 2nd century Greek physician whose comprehensive theories of human physiology remained authoritative in the West for more than 1,000 years. In Galenic medicine, sleep was understood as one of the 6 non-natural things, those external conditions that, properly managed, maintained health, and improperly managed, produced disease. Sleep was the period during which the vital spirits were refreshed and the digestion of food was completed. Its deprivation was understood to dry out the body, to overheat it, to produce an imbalance among the 4 humors that would eventually manifest as illness. The physician monks who staffed the monastery infirmaries, men trained in this tradition, would have recognized the signs of chronic sleep insufficiency in their brothers with considerable clarity, even if their explanatory framework differed from ours. A brother whose complexion was persistently sallow, whose eyes carried a permanent shadow beneath them, whose concentration during the office wandered despite evident effort, such a man was understood to be suffering from an imbalance that had, among its causes, insufficient or disrupted rest. The medicine available to address this was limited: herbs, dietary adjustment, rest prescribed by the infirmarian. But the schedule itself, the bell, the vigils, the interrupted night, that was not within the physician's power to alter.
The monastery infirmary occupies a particular place in the architecture of Benedictine life. Benedict devotes an entire chapter of the rule to the care of the sick. Chapter 36, one of the most humanly affecting passages in the entire document. He writes that care of the sick must rank above and before all else, so that they may truly be served as Christ. The infirmarian is to be a man of patience and diligence. The sick are to receive what they require, including meat when it would restore them, and baths when they are needed.
The dispensations are notable precisely because they are dispensations, exceptions to the ordinary austerity of monastic life, granted freely and without reproach to those whose bodies have reached their limit. Among the most significant of those dispensations was exemption from vigils. A monk genuinely too ill to rise at 2 a.m. was not compelled to rise. The rule makes provision for this. The sick brother was to remain in the infirmary, attended by a competent and caring monk, excused from the night office until his health permitted return. This was not a failure of devotion, it was a recognition, encoded in the rule itself, that the body has limits which the spirit must sometimes respect. How many monks reached that threshold of illness, and how many endured beyond it out of the particular stubbornness that sustained devotion can produce, is impossible to say with precision. But the infirmary was not empty.
The physical record of monastic life, where it has been recovered through archaeological examination of monastic burial sites, tells a story of characteristic wear. Analysis of skeletal remains from medieval Benedictine and Cistercian houses in England and continental Europe has revealed patterns consistent with a life of sustained low-level physical stress. Joint disease, particularly in the spine and the knees, is disproportionately present, attributed in part to the long hours of standing required by the divine office and the hunched posture of scribal work. Dental evidence suggests variable nutrition across the calendar year, with the lean periods of fasting leaving their mark in the developing tissue of younger monks. The general picture is of a body that lived longer than many of their peasant contemporaries. The shelter, the community care, and the relative abundance of many monastic houses conferred real advantages, but that carried within them the evidence of years of sustained demand. The broken nights are not visible in a femur or a vertebra. They leave no direct skeletal trace, but they are present in what is absent, in the accumulated deficit that a body carries invisibly through decades, and that contributes, in ways no single examination can isolate, to the overall pattern of wear.
And yet, the long-lived monk is not a fiction. The historical record contains, scattered across the centuries, abbots and ordinary brothers who maintained the full rigor of the monastic schedule into their 70s and 80s. Men who had risen at 2 for 50 years and continued, with diminished but unbroken commitment, to rise still. This is not evidence that the toll was minor. It is evidence of something that sits alongside the toll: adaptation, community, purpose, and the particular resilience that a life ordered around something larger than the self can sometimes produce. Purpose, it turns out, is not without biological consequence. A body that knows why it is doing what it is doing may endure what a body without that knowledge cannot. The monks who rose at 2 understood with a clarity that gave structure to every cold morning exactly why the bell was sounding. That understanding did not make the cold floor warmer, but it made the rising possible, night after night, in a way that mere habit could not have sustained alone. The monks understood the toll in their own terms. In the theology that shaped their daily existence, the body was not an obstacle to the spiritual life, but its instrument and companion. To offer the body in service, to accept its fatigue, its cold, its accumulated weariness as part of what was being given, was not punishment. It was participation. The exhausted monk who stood in the candle-lit choir at 2 a.m. and sang his psalms with cracking voice was not defeating his body. He was, in his understanding, offering it. And the offering had value precisely because it cost something real. This is a theology that the modern world finds difficult. We have built our entire relationship with the body around the language of optimization, of peak performance, adequate rest, managed recovery. The idea that fatigue might be a form of gift rather than a deficit to be corrected sits uneasily within that framework. But the monks were not trying to optimize. They were trying to attend night after night to something that they believed required their presence regardless of how they felt.
Your body, as you listen now, is doing none of that. There is no bell coming. There is no cold floor waiting. Whatever this night asks of you, it does not ask for vigils. It does not ask for psalms in the dark or bare feet on stone. It asks only that you rest, and that, in the long history of what human bodies have been required to endure in the name of the things they held most important, is a very quiet and very generous ask. Accept it. Every bell eventually falls silent. In the autumn of 1536, the commissioners of King Henry VIII of England began their work. They traveled in small groups, armed with legal instruments and royal authority, from one religious house to the next, across the length and breadth of the English countryside. They carried ledgers, they made inventories, they assessed the value of the plate, the vestments, the lead upon the roofs, the timber in the barns, the livestock in the fields. They were efficient men performing a legal function, and they moved through the monasteries with the quiet purposefulness of people who have no particular animosity toward what they are ending, but no hesitation about ending it. What they were ending had existed in England alone for nearly 1,000 years.
The dissolution proceeded in 2 stages. The smaller houses, those with fewer than 12 monks and an annual income below a certain threshold, were suppressed first under the Act of 1536. The larger, wealthier abbeys followed in a second wave between 1538 and 1541 through a combination of surrender, coercion, and legislative compulsion. By the time the process was complete, more than 800 religious houses had been dissolved, their assets transferred to the crown, their communities dispersed. The monks themselves were not, for the most part, imprisoned or executed, though some who resisted met those ends. Most were pensioned, given modest annual payments, and released into a world that had, in many cases, been entirely absent from their experience for decades. Elderly monks who had entered their houses as young men, who had lived the entirety of their adult lives within the cloister, found themselves standing outside gates that would not open for them again. Some found employment as parish priests. Some lived out their remaining years quietly in private households. Some simply disappeared from the historical record, as people without institutions to document them tend to do. The buildings stood empty.
The names of those buildings are, for anyone who has walked among them, among the most evocative in the English language. Revo in the North Yorkshire Valley, its great nave open to the sky, its arches still standing in their rows like the ribs of some vast and patient creature. Fountains Abbey, whose tower rises from the green floor of the Skell Valley with an authority that 5 centuries of exposure have not diminished. Tintern in its river bend in Wales, the subject of a poem by Wordsworth that understands, without quite naming, the specific quality of a ruin that was once inhabited by deliberate silence.
Whitby on its cliff above the North Sea, where the wind moves through the empty window frames with a sound that is not entirely unlike a distant choir. Glastonbury, whose abbot, Richard Whiting, was hanged, drawn, and quartered upon the Tor in 1539, the last significant act of resistance to the dissolution of the house he had served for 30 years. These were not marginal places. They were among the most significant institutions in medieval England, centers of learning, of agricultural innovation, of medical care, of manuscript production, of the continuous, uninterrupted prayer that the monastic tradition understood as a service rendered on behalf of all humanity.
What fell silent in those years was not merely an institution. The bell that had rung at 2 a.m. in some of these houses every night for 4 or 5 centuries without significant interruption rang for the last time. The dormitory that had received its community into first sleep night after night through cold and illness and the ordinary passage of uncounted years was emptied. The Calefactory fire went out. The choir stalls where the psalms had been sung in alternation, where the breath of monks had clouded in the winter air of the unheated church, stood vacant. The great book of the Psalter, from which those psalms had been read and eventually no longer needed because they lived in memory, was gone, carried away in the inventory, or burned, or simply lost in the dispersal of a community that had no center left to return to. A particular way of inhabiting the night, that ancient, structured, deeply human arrangement of sleep and prayer and sleep again, ended with the dissolution of the houses that had sustained it. Not everywhere, not permanently, but in England in that decade, comprehensively.
The ruins that remain are beautiful in a way that is inseparable from what they lost. A roofed building is complete. A ruined one is something else, an argument made in stone about time, about impermanence, about the gap between what human beings build and what endures. The great abbeys of England, standing in their fields with their windows open to the rain, their floors reclaimed by grass, their walls slowly surrendering their mortar to the patient work of frost and root, carry a quality of presence that is difficult to name precisely. They are not sad, exactly. They are not merely picturesque. They are perhaps honest, more honest than they were when they were whole, because they no longer conceal the temporariness of the thing they once contained. The stones are still there. The proportions are still there. On a quiet morning in certain lights, something of the silence that was cultivated within those walls for so many centuries still lingers in the air between the arches. Some things dissolve more slowly than stone. It is worth noting before we leave this chapter that the Rule of Saint Benedict was not dissolved with the monasteries. It survived. It continues. There are Benedictine communities today, in England, in Europe, across the world, living by the same rule, rising for the same offices, moving through the same daily architecture of prayer and work and sleep that Benedict outlined in the 6th century. The tradition was interrupted in many places. It was never erased. The bell rings still in those houses, in the deep hours of the night. Someone rises. Someone lights the candles. The dormitory is not, everywhere, empty. But here, in this final chapter, we rest with what was lost. Not to mourn it in any way that disturbs the quiet, but simply to acknowledge it, to let its weight settle gently as old things deserve to settle.
1,000 years of bells rung in the dark, 1,000 years of bare feet on cold stone, and breath fogging in unheated churches, and psalms rising into the air of spaces that no longer stand. 1,000 years of first sleep, and the night office, and second sleep, and the slow turning of the sky toward lauds. All of it held now in nothing more substantial than these words, and the silence between them, and the long memory of stones that still stand in their fields, open to whatever weather arrives. You have followed these monks through their night. You have heard the bell, and felt the cold, and stood for a moment in the candle-lit church at 2 in the morning. You have carried something of that journey here, to the edge of your own sleep. Let it go now. The bell will not ring. The dormitory is warm and still, and yours. Close your eyes. The night continues as it always has, quietly, without instruction, without ceremony, without end. Sleep well.
The monks of a Benedictine monastery in the 6th century did not have a science of sleep. They had no understanding of circadian rhythms, no vocabulary for slow-wave sleep or REM cycles, no instruments to measure the architecture of a night's rest. They did not speak of cortisol or adenosine, of sleep pressure or chronobiology. None of that language existed. None of those concepts had been formed. And yet, in constructing the rule, in laying out with extraordinary care the precise shape of each day and each night, Benedict of Nursia created something that modern sleep research, working from an entirely different premises and methods, has spent decades attempting to recover and describe. He created a complete architecture of rest, one that honored the body's deepest needs without ever naming them as such.
Consider what that architecture contained. It contained darkness, genuine, unmediated darkness, uncompromised by any artificial light. The kind of darkness that allows the body's natural chemistry to proceed without interruption, that permits the sleeping mind to go where it needs to go without the constant interference of illumination that the modern world provides in such relentless abundance. It contained ritual, the slow, repeated ceremonies of Compline and the Great Silence, which prepared the body and the mind for sleep, not through any deliberate intention to do so, but through the sheer accumulative weight of repetition. The same prayers, the same hour, the same candles, the same silence. The body, after enough repetitions, needed only the first note of the evening hymn to begin its own quiet preparations. It contained community, the knowledge of other bodies breathing in shared space, the regulated warmth of proximity, the particular security of sleeping within a structure that continues to function while you rest. The dormitory was not merely a practical arrangement, it was a form of human trust expressed in stone and straw. It contained segmented rest, that ancient and natural division of the night into 2 sleeps, separated by a period of wakefulness given over to prayer rather than anxiety. The monks did not fight the waking that came in the middle of the night. They received it, they gave it purpose, and in doing so they transformed what the modern world so often experiences as insomnia into something it was always meant to be, a natural pause between one kind of rest and another. And it contained the Calefactory, the warmth that waited after the cold, the fire that restored what the night had taken, the small and sufficient grace of a body returning to its preferred temperature before the day required anything of it. We have lost most of this.
The modern night is lit from end to end. Ritual, where it survives, is largely private and improvised rather than communal and deep-rooted. We sleep alone or in pairs, behind closed doors, without the regulating presence of a community whose rhythms set our own. We fight our middle-of-the-night wakenings with medication and white noise, rather than meeting them with the quiet acceptance that pre-industrial humanity understood as simply the nature of things. This is not an argument for becoming monks. It is simply an observation that something was known in those cold stone buildings along the rivers of early medieval Europe that we have covered over with light and convenience and speed. Something about the body's actual requirements for rest. Something about the conditions under which the human animal sleeps most deeply and wakes most whole. The monks knew these things in their bones because they lived them every night of their lives, in community, within a structure that asked them to cooperate with their own biology rather than overcome it.
Tonight, you have passed through something of that architecture. You have followed a community of monks from the last candle of Compline, through the bell at 2 in the morning, through the cold church and the candlelit psalms, back to the dormitory, into the second sleep, and finally to the single warm room where the fire holds its patient watch against the dark. You have done this from within your own warmth, your own quiet, your own version of the Great Silence. And if the words have done their work, if the pace and the darkness and the long, unhurried sentences have carried you somewhere useful, then perhaps you are already in some portion of yourself where the monks arrived each night after vigils, in that quieter country, in that second sleep. You do not need a rule for what happens next. Your body already knows. Thank you for spending these quiet hours in our cozy corner of history. The monks have kept their watch. The fire is still burning. Sleep well.